Hello everyone, welcome to another Book Review Wednesday, and today I am going to be discussing the second book of Historic Materials, The Subtile Knife, written by Philip Pullman. Last week I discussed The Golden Compass, which was the first book within this series, so if you want to check that out, it is exactly a week old, so being last Wednesday. And for this Wednesday, we're going to talk about the second book, which is the mid book, basically like the in between of the beginning and the end, because this series is a trilogy. So without further ado, let me address this story and kind of how it sort of ties into what's going on, or what did pass within the first book, and sort of address to the kind of story it's trying to focus on. So basically, within the first book, we were sort of introduced to the characters, in particular our main character, Lyra. There's this whole world that she lives in that's completely different from our own, and if you want more information, more context onto that, I would definitely recommend checking out my review of the first book, because that provides you all of the context that you need. But basically, from where we left off from the first book, she ends up finding herself in another world called Cittàgazze, where basically you have these soul eaters called specters and angels. So yeah, it's supposed to be a very bizarre, kind of strange world. Again, sort of similar to the bizarre, strange world that she initially was in the first book, which was actually supposed to be sort of her home world. But we find her there, and she ultimately comes across another character who does make a huge impact within the rest of the series, and his name is Will Parry, and he basically ends up finding himself in this world as well, and you will sort of see the circumstances as to how he ends up there, and you'll sort of see the circumstances too of how Lyra ends up in this world too. But basically, that is where we sort of establish the plot. These two being within this bizarre world and then sort of coming together. And in doing so, going through various obstacles and stages and sort of these different plot points. And sometimes even coming across characters that were from the first story. Or, excuse me, first book. Which is basically another story sort of on its own, but at the same time, the second book does tie in with a lot of what happened within the first book. There's just a lot of different scenarios kind of going on. Since Will Parry and Lyra are from two completely different worlds, it's very hard for them to initially really kind of understand each other. At points, Will Parry is sort of confused, as to why she has this pet that follows her around everywhere. And you will see within the first book where I sort of discussed Lyra's world, basically within her world where she grew up, pets are sort of like a sort of manifestation of the human character. So and they're called daemons. So basically, each person has a pet, so to speak, or daemon. So he finds that to be rather bizarre in nature. And he also finds a lot of other things. And Lyra also realizes that there's things that Will is familiar with that she's not really all too familiar with. And I think it is established, at least from what I can remember, is that Will Perry is supposed to be a part of our world, from what I can tell. As far as, worlds go, he seems to be the one um, who seems to identify with Earth in the sense that you feel like this is a person that is from the planet Earth, unlike the other characters that come into play, in particular the main character Lyra. So that's, I think, a really important distinction to have, and you sort of see like how this sort of leads to conflict initially in trying to establish their sort of purpose within this grander scheme plot that they end up going through. And ultimately, their relationship develops and they sort of learn how to work together, and they just kind of overcome the obstacles that are sort of thrown in their way. And again, I don't want to give away those obstacles because that would be, I think, spoiling it. And ultimately, how a lot of the characters from the first book sort of re-emerge within this book. And there's also things too that they discover sort of on their own as to how they ultimately how they play into the scheme of things. Lyra, you sort of got a sense of how she plays in with how she fits into this uh, plot within the first book, and you sort of see that extended in this book. And Will Perry, you sort of see ultimately kind of discovering and developing probably on a different pace than Lyra, since he is way far behind as to what's really going on. So again, there's that sort of distinction. I think that's also important to make. And I think what it does good as far as a mid book goes, or a second installment, is that it leaves the audience sort of wanting more. You ultimately feel like you are kind of on the uh, not so to speak cliffhanger, but you're at the point towards the end where you want to ultimately see some kind of conclusion come out of the circumstances that they end up being in. And I think that's usually what good books that are within that are the mid book sort of do within a trilogy. They leave the audience wanting to have sort of a conclusion, or they make the audience think a lot more, I think, than in the first installment, where it's just basically exposition and introductory material. This book, I think, has a little bit more meat to it, only because there seems to be like an upping of stakes. Even though there was a lot established within the first book that created a lot of stakes as well, this one seems to bring in a lot more, considering the fact that Will Perry is from a different world and they're already in this other world. So yeah, it's just it just gets a little bit more it shifts focus and then brings in a lot more to the table that sets up for sort of the ending. So I guess that's the best way I can describe as to how it really works as a in betweener book. And yeah, I think this one is a little bit more straightforward as far as plot is concerned. Yes, there's some twists and turns that end up happening, but the way it sets itself up is, I think, a lot easier to explain, because again, it's just these two characters, going through this journey and trying to find their place and ultimately kind of just defeat the bad guys, which basically are pretty much the same from the first book, which again, if you read the first book, you will see. So I definitely do not recommend reading this book first if you're interested in this series, because I think there will be a lot of confusion. I would definitely recommend picking up the first book and reading that one. And if you like the way it's going with the first book, then pick up the second book. If there's nothing really too much for you in the first book, you're probably not going to be a huge fan of this one, because it's pretty much executed in a similar way. But at the same time, I feel like that there's a lot more meat and weight put into this book, because again, we're leading up to the conclusion. But again, it just kind of depends on if you like the characters, if you like the way it's going. It really, all these factors really do play a role in the enjoyment of this series. So I would definitely, though, recommend that you first take a look at the second book before trying to dive in, or for the go into the first book before reading the second book. I think it avoids a lot of confusion. But yeah, I think that's really all I can say. But again, if there are any questions, comments, concerns, be more than happy to answer them. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year. I know that this book is kind of designed to be one with a lot of spoilers attached to it. And again, I wish I could explain more when it comes to the plot, but doing so I think would reveal too much. But yeah, I think there's a lot more context, though, established if you do read the first book. So if you have not seen my first book within the series review, it was done last week on Wednesday. It's called The Golden Compass. And this is its follow-up, The Subtle Knife. And the last one will be The Amber Spyglass, which I will be reviewing next week. But I think that's really ultimately all I can say. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you on the next video. Take care.